y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Telus and GovLove co-host. We have a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking resiliency and sustainability in Charleston. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. ELGL is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. Now, let me introduce today's guests. First, Dale Morris is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Charleston, South Carolina, a position he's been in since 2021. Previously, he worked for the Water Institute of the Gulf, a technical research nonprofit focused on flood risk mitigation in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. And our second guest is Katie McKain. She's the Director of Sustainability for the City of Charleston, a position she's been in since 2014. Before coming to the city, she worked as a planner for the U.S. Department of Commerce and landscape designer. And with that, Dale, Katie, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for chatting with me and joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. So we have a tradition on the podcast to help our guests warm up a little and let our listeners get to know you a little bit more, to do a lightning round. So Dale, we'll start with you on the first question, but what was the first concert that you went to?
It was the band called Dire Straits.
Nice.
The late 70s as they were going on, and still one of my favorite guitarists.
Awesome. Very cool. Katie, what about you?
Mine was Dave Matthews in high school.
Nice. Dave Matthews. Awesome. Those are two great first concerts. Yeah, very impressive. All right, Katie, we'll make you go first on this one. What book are you currently reading?
Oh, I'm reading too. So my book club is reading Good Inside by Becky Kennedy. And I'm reading Atomic Habits by James Clear also.
Oh, nice. I've got Atomic Habits on my shelf. Is that a good one? Should I move it up the list? Yeah.
It's great.
Cool. Dale, what about you? What book are you reading?
Yeah, I'm also reading too. I'm reading Ulysses S. Grant by Ron Chernow and a book called Love by an Irish author named Roddy Doyle.
Awesome. All right, so Dale, we'll come back to you for the first answer on this next question. Sure. What was the last movie you saw in theaters or streamed?
Well, that would be All Quiet on the Western Front that's currently streaming on either Netflix or Prime.
Nice. And Katie, what about you?
I tend to like the classics, so this week I saw Forrest Gump.
Oh, okay. Classic. That is a classic. Tom Hanks at his finest. All right, Katie, for our last lightning question, where do you go for inspiration?
It's a great question. I go outside to my garden where I grow all my vegetables.
Very cool. Dale, what about you?
Well, although in the Low Country, and I work with a lot of low-lying and have worked with a lot of low-lying cities and people, I go to the mountains. I'm a skier, and I just love the crisp, fresh air and the long mountain views. So I go to the mountains. Nice.
Yeah, I resemble that remark. I love going to the mountains to kind of reset and get away. Yeah. All right. So one thing, close listeners to the podcast know when I host, I always like to ask folks about kind of their path into local government. Like, and your bios covered maybe some highlights, but I'm curious for each of y'all, how'd you end up in local government? How'd you end up working for the City of Charleston? So, Katie, maybe we can make you go first since you've been at the city longer.
Sure. Well, I started at the city in a little bit of a roundabout way. I've worked in the private sector and also for the federal government. And I was looking to move to Charleston. So my first job offer came from the City of Charleston, and that was exciting. And ever since I've moved here, I have really felt passionate about how much more impacts I can have at that local government level. So even though it kind of came in directly, it's really proven to be so rewarding.
Yeah. And what's kind of kept you at the city? You've been, there a fair amount of time. So what's kept you here?
I think just the impacts that we make at the local level and the positions that we're in to help drive change.
Yeah. Very cool. And Dale, what about you? What's been your path to local government?
Well, I started at the federal level working in the U.S. Congress and then worked for many years for the Netherlands government in the U.S., coordinating their climate and water flood risk work in the U.S. And after that, I was working for a nonprofit, the Water Institute, And all through those years, I was predominantly working with local government cities across the U.S. and counties, but primarily cities across the Southeast, Northeast, and the Gulf Coast. And one of those cities was Charleston. And so I've only been in local government for the last 15 months, and I find it fascinating, challenging, and I think my previous national and international experience has helped me. Hope it's helping me to have some impact here.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm sure you probably have a different perspective on some of the local issues than maybe other folks at the city, right?
And I do, and yes, I do, and I have a different background from a lot of resilience officers, so I think it gives me a unique perspective. I hope it doesn't get in the way.
Yeah, that's great, awesome. So before we kind of get into some of your work, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with the city of Charleston, but can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit maybe what makes, or a little bit about Charleston, maybe what makes the resilience and sustainability work kind of unique, or so I don't know who wants to take maybe a first stab at this, but I'm just curious, like, to kind of set the stage a little bit, like what are some of the like big picture things that you guys have to keep in mind as you're doing your work?
Katie, would you like to go, and I'll bat second?
Sure. So Charleston is a very old historic city with a strong center, and we pride ourselves in our historic character and uniqueness, and we have faced a lot of extreme weather challenges, I believe, in the last few years that have really helped bring sustainability and resilience work to the forefront of what Charleston does now. Hurricanes and major events year after year after year, where we're activating the emergency operations center, and people's homes are getting flooded, streets are flooded, and it's really helped people wake up to the fact that we really do need to do something, and the clock is really ticking.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and I'll add, in addition to the city's historic nature. So it is a large city by land mass. It's 155 square miles, which is larger than Atlanta and Boston, and about half the size of New York City. So It's a large area, and we have 3 peninsulas and 2 barrier islands within the city that we're managing. So the water's all around us. So water is is the threat, and it's not getting any easier. 57% of the city's in the floodplain.
Wow.
And that's a lot, right?
Yeah.
So we have to be careful here. And as sea level rise increases, that's not going to get any smaller. Than in fact, it's going to increase. So we have those challenges. We're not a large city, 157,000 people. We nest within Charleston County, but the city itself at 157,000 people. Keep in mind that about 40,000 of those residents are relatively new. They've moved here in the last 12 to 15 years. So a tremendous amount of development pressure and land use pressure. And of course, we're flat, called the low country for a reason. So, we're flat. We have increasing water levels, rain bombs, king tides, and storm surge risk, and likely in the future, groundwater risk. So there's a lot of challenges here with water. But whatever we do, we have to be able to make sure we maintain this historic core, this beautiful aesthetic to preserve this place, because it is rather special. And we have the largest historic district in the nation. So it is not only a sort of a local asset, it's a national asset. So there's a lot going on here. And of course, Charleston as a region is often seen as, the most, tourist magazines, hey, visit Charleston, the best place to visit, and retirees, hey, Charleston region, the best place to retire to. So this is this development push. But we have Boeing and a number of other major corporations here too. So we have a dynamic economy. So there's all these challenges come together, but they also create opportunities to adapt.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Well, and to give our listeners maybe a peek behind the curtain a little, we had to reschedule this interview originally because of the hurricane. I believe it was Ian. There's been a couple since now, but and so just we don't have to go into the nitty gritty of it. But can you talk a little bit about some of the impacts of that? And I know you guys were both in the EOC when it came ashore. So
yeah. So I mean, we started to watch Ian as it was still south and east of Cuba. Mm-hmm. We were watching the track, and of course, I had worked with the city of Tampa, and the most a dangerous hurricane track for them is a storm that comes up the west coast of Florida and then makes landfall to the north of them. And for a number of days, that was the track that people were worried about. And I know some folks there, so it was concerning. But the track kept moving, east each time the Hurricane Center updated the storm track. And we saw, eventually what happened in Fort Myers, which was, quite awful and disturbing. And,
Mm-hmm.
We surely hope they recover as well as they can down there. But the track, took the storm over Florida, and they knew it was going to go back over the Atlantic, but where it was going to make landfall again on the East Coast was still a bit in question. There was a moment where we had the track was going to come a little bit south. Landfall was a little bit south and west of the city, which is the most deadliest or most damaging type of storm surge for the city to have because of the way surge manifests. So there was a period on Wednesday night and Thursday morning where we were the epicenter of the East Coast landfall.
Yeah.
And it was very disturbing. We would have had the second highest storm surge ever in the region, and it would have been pretty bad. Fortunately for us, the storm kept tracking east a little bit, and we had minimal surge impacts, no tide impacts. But we did have a large swath of rain come through, and in some places we had 10 inches of rain in a couple of hours, which is a lot.
Wow.
And so we had a number of damaged homes from the rainfall, flooded homes, streets, things like that. So again, some impacts, but it could have been a lot worse. Our neighbors to the north took the brunt of it, and we're hoping for their speedy recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Katie, anything you'd add to that? I know it's not like the main focus of our conversation today, but since it's timely.
I'd just say the Emergency Operations Center, I think it's always such a pleasure to be part of that team because everyone really works together in this major group effort where we're trying to, communicate as transparently as possible with our citizens and community members and try to, collaborate with organizations that have resources. And it always melts my heart a little bit being part of that group effort when these huge disasters come through.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I mean, that's probably a good, place setting for both of your guys' work is talking a little bit about the storm surge impacts that you guys are prepare for and work on. And also, I imagine the storm water component like that a storm like Ian reveals. And then the frequency of these kind of storms is probably justify a lot of your work as well. So as kind of a, at a high level, like what kind of guides both of your guys' works and maybe as you talk about that, like how do you guys kind of, categorize sustainability versus resiliency? Because I know a lot of places that those are kind of blended. You two work together. So how do you, what's kind of in each bucket for the two? And maybe Katie, you can go first on this one.
Sure. Well, the two are certainly related. In Charleston, we focus on sustainability being a lot more mitigation focused. So how are we actually addressing the root cause of the problem, which of climate change, which is by reducing emissions. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my work is very focused on reducing emissions, and I follow the Climate Action Plan, which outlines that. Versus Dale works a lot more on the resilient side, and we consider that more on the adaptation side. So how do we adjust to the impacts from climate change, such as flooding and sea level rise? So that's how we try to look at it, but they certainly cross over in many places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dale, anything you'd add to that?
No, that Katie described our work ideally. So it's two of us, and we have a looming position that we hope to have created for us next year, and we beg and cajole other city staff to help us succeed. So that's part of our job is to certainly my job, and Katie does it too. Is the city has a number of departments and divisions, and they all have mandates and sort of performance requirements, and citizens and council members are watching them. And so, those departments have to, perform. But our job is to make sure that within the city, we are meeting these adaptation goals, which actually requires us to be, a bit of a diplomat and a little bit of a beggar and cajoler to get people to help us achieve the goals that are in the flooding and sea level rise strategy or the climate action plan. So that's sort of what we do. And we work with a lot of different partners. You know, for me, I work with a lot of the folks in the old 100 Resilient Cities Network, which is now Resilient Cities, the Resilient Cities Network. And, there's an informal group of CROs that I know, and we bounce ideas off of each other. And of course, we use, there's a lot of science that helps us push things forward. So NOAA and NASA and the U.S. Geologic Service, other parts of the federal government, the data that they put out is very important for us.
Very cool. And I think in preparation for this interview, I read about on your website, you have all hazards, vulnerability, and risk assessment. And I don't know if this is the best document to start with, because I know there's lots of plans and strategies that y'all have. So can you talk maybe a little bit about that and how that kind of informs maybe the other plans or your work in general?
All hazards vulnerability assessment was our way of trying to get more informed data around all the hazards that Charleston faces. And we know that water is a challenge, flooding from different ways, from tidal, from rainfall, from surge, and from sea level rise. But we didn't know to the extent of it and what were the details, the economic details specifically tied to that. So the analysis really got very technical about, the economic impact of these hazards in certain locations, and helped identify where are the priority projects and priority locations we need to focus on to make sure that we're keeping up the economic engine of the city of Charleston. So it was very neat to see some of the details that came out of that, even though, we already knew some of the hazards that existed. It was also neat to see some of the different hazards that we don't often think about come to attention. So, for example, there are a lot of earthquakes in South Carolina, and it wasn't really on a lot of people's radar. So things like that.
Interesting. What were, you mentioned it was neat to see some of the risks that came out of it. Like, what were maybe an example other than the earthquakes that maybe surprised you, or was ways to prioritize that you wouldn't have thought at the beginning of the process?
I'll take a stab at that because it's one of the things that we do here. So, of course, water is our highest risk, right? Flooding manifests in different ways, and one of the things that we saw from the all hazards vulnerability analysis was that storm surge is our highest risk. It's not a high occurrence, right? It's sort of a black swan thing. But when it occurs, it is going to cause the most damage to the city.
Yeah. So
that was sort of, a lot of people were worried about the rain bombs, and rightfully so. But storm surge, again, is the highest risk. And then this sort of floodplain inundation risk, which is both rainfall and tidal. Charleston is low, so when we get king tides, roads get wet. The rivers come into the city in some way across the perimeter roads. Roads get blocked, so that's a challenge. But that's going to increase, going forward with sea level rise because we're connected right to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's there. But we also have this earthquake risk. We also have this heat risk, right? A lot of cities in the South have that, and we need to pay more attention to it. And this was very useful for us to justify spending some time and energy on it. And one of the things the all hazards vulnerability analysis quantified for us was also sort of social impact of these risks. So we were able to tease out and understand better, which communities have higher social vulnerability and thus are less able to adapt or respond to these hazards. So it helps us allocate resources or think about where we're going to work.
Yeah. Helps you prioritize. And
yes, sir.
Yeah. That makes sense. Interesting. So I assume then that's something like that gets updated regularly, or is it just kind of, you've got the data now and you're going to run with it until you implement everything you can implement?
We have a tool that we can use to continue to understand that data as needed. The consultant firm that did that for us gave us a tool. These risks don't change quickly. Again, so that's important. But the city is undertaking presently. We're developing an annex to the county's hazard mitigation plan for the city. And there we're going to look, update some of the natural hazard risks, but also then look at some of the man-made and other types of hazards, whether that's, terrorism or active shooter or, pandemic or those kinds of things. So the hazard mitigation plan that we're working on will dig into those a little bit more.
Very cool. Yeah, we'll be sure to link to that assessment too, and then show notes for this episode for listeners that want to find out more about kind of what goes into that kind of assessment.
Yeah, we're just starting it. So the consultant team is just starting. We hope to have the hazard mitigation plan done within 9 months.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I can't remember. I know you have some information on your website about it, so we'll link to whatever that is.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. And then, Katie, you mentioned the climate action plan. Can you talk a little about that process, how that came about, and kind of maybe some of the focus areas?
Sure. So the climate action plan is really my office's bread and butter. And we actually we adopted our first climate action plan in May of 2021. We had a climate action plan made back in 2010 that was never adopted by City Council.
Oh, really? Wow.
I wasn't in the position at that time, so I can't really speak to that, but we had different leadership at that time and different people were part of that process. But it was really good to see the community and council members really come on board and join this effort, and they ended up unanimously approving this plan. We had a huge community volunteer effort to help create the content of this plan. So we had 6 different focus groups meeting regularly. This was in the heart of COVID during 2020. So it was all virtual meetings at the time, which, in some ways makes it easier and in some ways makes it more challenging. But there were hundreds of volunteers involved in it and lots of support for it. And we made sure that we got diverse representation in our focus groups and really centered equity as the core of this plan. And it's really a 5-year strategic plan, and it's putting us on the path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, but a more short-term goal would be to reduce emissions 56% by 2030. So that is what we are focusing on right now. And it's really spread into 4 different categories: buildings, transportation, waste, and carbon sinks.
Huh. So, that's awesome. So, what are maybe a couple of, I don't know, example strategies in those areas, or can you just talk maybe a little more about like what are the ways you're going to tackle those kind of buckets?
Yeah. So there are, I believe, just over 50 action items that are listed in that plan. 50, yeah. So we're slowly tackling them as, resources allow us. As Dale mentioned, it's really just the 2 of us. Mm-hmm. And I'm more so focused on implementing the climate action plan, but a lot of it is breaking down silos and working with other departments that are working on some of these. So for example, like when we look at our specific city buildings, our parks department manages all of our city facilities. So working with them collaboratively to help, figure out what the challenges are and what potential solutions are as we're doing research. And I would say that there's some of the actions happening, some of the activities happening right now. So for example, in the waste sector, we really focused on composting this year. Cool. So we started our first food scrap composting program in January. We started piloting it, and it's been really successful. So we're hoping that becomes a full service program in 2023, and that will get approved in our budget request. It's basically just a drop site program, a model that's been really successful in a lot of other cities. So no need to reinvent the wheel here. We have a great network of sustainability folks all across the country that all support each other. And then I'd say in our transportation sector, we're doing a lot with electric vehicle infrastructure and trying to transition our city fleet to zero emission vehicles. And we have some planning efforts happening at the regional level right now that are going to be pretty exciting. So we can leverage, regional resources and really work together on how best to add electric vehicle infrastructure, and then take that plan and go after some big federal funding that's recently been announced in the last year to help support the implementation of electric charging infrastructure plan. So there's some exciting things on the horizon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I read about like maybe like electric lawn equipment expo, and like I assume that's all kind of up under that strategy area.
Yeah, it's up there. In the fall, we passed a resolution to transition our city leaf blowers to electric by the summer of
Yeah.
2023. So that was our way of leading by example, trying to help encourage the private sector to start that transition, trying to show folks and bring some attention that this technology is already there. The battery technology is there. It's excellent. It's efficient. It's effective, and it worked. So part of that part of that effort was to go out in the community, and we actually partnered with a local store, and they held the event and showcased all their battery powered lawn equipment, let people test drive and test use, and then we offered a discount to try to incentivize folks to purchase them. So it was a really successful event, and I think brought a lot of attention in the local community to the electric lawn care equipment and how powerful it actually is.
That's really cool. Yeah. Awesome. Well, so one of your focus areas, I think you said, was carbon sinks, and that's maybe a term I've heard in relation to climate action and climate change generally, but I haven't seen necessarily in like a city's climate action plan. So what does that mean? And then like what's an example of maybe something that a city could do under a carbon sink category?
Sure. So carbon sinks are basically your natural areas that are already very naturally absorbing carbon. So they're sequestering carbon dioxide. So think of a tree and photosynthesis, right? They sequester carbon dioxide. Our marshes, the mangroves south in Florida, those all sequester a large amount of carbon. So our protecting and enhancing, our marsh areas and doing marsh restorations and making sure that, we're protecting water quality so these areas can thrive is super important to continue that sequestration that's already happening. We're also testing the application of, we'd like to test there's some plants that are especially good at absorbing carbon and floodwaters. So we're looking at piloting some of those plants and trying to figure out what those could be, if they could be a good adaptation practice that could also mitigate. But I'd say a really big one is just planting more trees and making sure we're planning appropriately for our tree canopy to grow and thrive over time, making sure we have a diversity of species and there's a diversity of age in the canopy and things like that. So we are in the planning process right now. We're hoping to get some funding to do a street tree inventory so we can learn exactly where all our trees are, what age they are, what species they are, et cetera, so we can make sure that we are taking care of that canopy in the most appropriate way possible. And that will also help us plan for future planting. So trees are super valuable. They also absorb a whole lot of stormwater, right, Dale?
Yeah,
They do, and they reduce heat risk mitigation, or they mitigate heat. So they're an essential long-term adaptation tool as well as a mitigation tool. Let me just add to what Katie said about this carbon sink issue. So, marshes and trees, we have an abundance of those. We have some great, grand oaks around here, and they do store a lot of stormwater. What the marshes do, they capture and sequester carbon too, and they also provide some residual tidal adaptation and flood risk mitigation. It's wonderful, but there is a tremendous amount of research being done by the Waters Gulf and others around the Gulf Coast region to quantify the economic benefits of restoring marsh. So, in the Gulf Coast, some of the marsh there is degraded or degrading, and that will become more of a challenge as the seas rise and the salt water pushes further inland. It'll challenge some of these, either the freshwater or the sort of the marshes that like the sort of the estuary nature or the brackish nature. So a lot of folks are funding research and how much economic value do we get from a carbon capture approach from restoring marshes? And so we think this is a very important way to accomplish a number of different things. Like I said, both flood risk mitigation and tidal adaptation, but also, achieving our carbon mitigation goals.
Yeah. No, that was one of the things like moving to Jacksonville that I feel like I learned and saw firsthand is like those like marshes act as like almost huge sponges when storms come. Like they help kind of absorb what otherwise would just be coming, into and hitting, the developed parts of the city. It's pretty fascinating to actually see, like, we call it feeding the swamp. Like,
Right. Yes. Mother Nature can do a lot of good things for us.
yeah, very
Yes.
cool. Well, that's a perfect transition to the city's kind of flooding and sea level rise strategy. So, Dale, can you talk a little bit about kind of that and some of the components of that work?
Sure, happy to. So the city, as Katie mentioned at the beginning, Charleston was fairly unaffected by massive floods or storms for a large period in the early 2000s and early part of the 20 teens, but 2015, 2016, and 2017, and then 2018 and 2019 too. But those first 3 years, I mean, there were major storms here and major flooding. We had 1,000-year rainfall. We had hurricanes that were, 200 miles away from us that caused storm surge in the city and king tides, crossing roads. And it was just where we had to pay attention to this. So in 2015, the city adopted its first flooding and sea level rise strategy, which, a high level document setting forth a number of directions to pursue and also some research and policy actions to consider. That was updated in 2019. Again, it got a little more nitty gritty, had a number of initiatives and goals, more concrete. And just this past summer, we spent time updating the 2019 strategy, and we're making our final polishing edits to that now, and that will be unveiled, hopefully in the next month or two. And again, it is just another iteration, a further level of detail into how the city is going to have to adapt. I think from a long-term planning perspective, we're assuming 2 to 4 feet of sea level rise by 27 or 2070 or 2080, and that's a very important directional goal. But it's really hard to translate that into action. Except we surely need to do some stuff on mitigation, right? And we need to not, if we're going to have that kind of an impact, we need to understand what's going on with our land use and all this development pressure and where we are putting homes and buildings and roads and critical infrastructure. That's good. So we maintain that 2 to 4 feet for the long-term planning horizon, but we're adopting, a 14 to 18 inch sea level rise amount by 2050. So that becomes a more actionable type of planning horizon for us. So that's pretty important. And then, starting with the 2015 strategy and continuing to the current update, we focus on a number of key areas. Governance is really important. So what policy and practices and procurement that's going on, within government to achieve these flood risk mitigation or sea level rise adaptation, in some ways carbon mitigation goals. We have resources. So all this stuff costs money. And so we need to make sure City Council funds these various projects. And it's our job to make sure that they're integrated. Land use, again, this development pressure we have here in this wonderful amount, this wonderful country land we have here in the Low Country, we need to be wise about it. We're seeing some regrets from decisions that were made only 20 or 30 years ago with siting of houses and developments, and they're now flooding, and that's not going to get any easier or better simply because of the way the water is flowing and the constrained outfalls because of sea level rise. And then we look at, our infrastructure. That's sort of mostly hard infrastructure, but we do have some green infrastructure things added to that. And so that's primarily our stormwater and our, transportation department. And then we have our outreach and partnerships, right? So we have a lot of partners and they teach us a lot and help us a lot, but we need to do much more with our citizens and with our stakeholders and with neighboring, towns and cities and the county and sort of the tri-county region. So those are the sort of the 5 focus areas for us. And, we're trying to do something in each one of them. And again, it's a lot of people are doing this, and it's Katie's job and my job is to make sure we're doing this in a coordinated and efficient fashion.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, just the stuff you said there, like that's so many different departments within the city, let alone like regional partners or neighbors. Like, right? That's a lot of coordination.
It's a lot of coordination and it's a lot of cajoling
Yeah,
because, as I said at the beginning, the departments, they have their own projects and goals, and people waiting for them to deliver things, right, and to
yeah,
consider things. And Katie and I have to, request their time and work with us, and they're all willing to do that. We don't have any resistance. It's just that everyone's very busy and we have a lot
yeah,
to do. So it's a matter of keeping everyone focused on the current projects, but also what this means for resilience and sustainability.
yeah. Well, and how do you guys? I'm just curious, how you guys go about doing that and like keeping folks, that longer term picture in mind. Because I know, in one of my old jobs, like, we were in charge of strategic plan, and some departments are totally bought in and, are totally fine with big picture strategies being part of their, work plans. And others are like, well, I've got all these like things that are part of my expectation that rank a little higher than maybe this long-term strategy. So how do you guys kind of help balance that where, the public works department, they know they need to pave roads and patch potholes, but also like they're going to be a big player in some of your guys' work. So how do you guys kind of balance that?
Yeah, so I mean, I primarily work with the planning department and the stormwater department.
Mm-hmm.
The roads are traffic and transportation department. Oddly enough, most of the roads in the city of Charleston are managed by the county and the state.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So the impact that we can have working with our traffic and transportation department on flood risk mitigation is limited. But we need, their support because they have the inroads to the county and the state. We need their support to say, okay, well, when you think of widening this road or adjusting traffic or making an investment to elevate the road, let's think about resilience. Let's think about what that looks like. And so we need to work with them so that they embrace that and understand that. But the folks in planning, sustainability, and preservation, they I would say they drink the same Kool-Aid that we
Yeah.
drink. They're all about this stuff, and they want to help us succeed. So that's easy. In the stormwater department, you have some folks that are looking at a small project area, and they need to achieve a certain level of service or a certain level of move this water away, and for this pipe and pump system or this drainage ditch system, right? But we also have to work with them to explain, okay, this is what the future means.
Yeah.
Do we need to have a 10% fudge factor on our level of service, or do we need to say, well, build to this elevation, but can we cajole everyone to maybe go a little bit higher, right? Just for an added level of resilience, right? And there are costs associated with that, so we have to sort of work through those costs and those sort of process to get people to understand that. So again, a lot of our job is, and we also educate the public so that they become advocates. Katie mentioned the wonderful group of folks that helped her with the climate action plan. They are now ambassadors and advocates. So it makes Katie's job so much easier. They're a multiplier. So it's just working with all of those folks.
Yeah. Yeah, Katie, anything you would add to that, or how some of that engagement has helped?
Yes, I'd say the Climate Ambassador program has done a lot for us. Like Dale said, it's been a multiplier, and we've been able to give, I think over 40 presentations in the past year just through the volunteer ambassadors support, and it's been so valuable, reaching over 1,000 people, like numbers that I just couldn't do on my own. So I think we tend to do a really good job engaging volunteers, and there's a lot of people who really want to help. So that's always good to see. And then it's more about, your capacity to manage volunteers. And that I'd say that's similar across to other departments. Dale and I work really hard to get folks out of silos and to collaborate more. And we're constantly talking with other departments and trying to figure out solutions together. But there's, like you said in the beginning, there's, that inherent, I have a different, job role. And, when you're talking to folks in other departments, they are supportive of what you're doing. And I get a lot of support, and Dale does too. But at the same time, we also get, it's hard to talk to someone about transitioning their fleet when they are worried they've got a garbage truck that's down and it's going to mess up the garbage schedule for the whole week, and they've got to figure that out,
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of emergencies like that happen often in local government just because of, funding capacity and limits inherent limits we have from, our property taxes being really low in the South and really not being enough to support what's really needed. So we face that a lot, just kind of, there's a hole in the roof. I can't talk to you about solar right now. So that's a challenge, but I'd say there's a lot of support for it both from the community and from other departments. So it's good that we, understand those challenges and are able to work with them.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, like land use, I imagine plays a huge component in both of your guys' work. And you guys have both mentioned that like development pressure, like people want to move to Charleston, so you got to put them somewhere. And, traditionally a lot of our cities, that means kind of building out and turning greenfield into houses. But if you want to take climate and flood risks seriously, over a long term, that's probably not the best idea, right? Like, so that's a tough balance.
Right. It depends on where and how.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of development and people have moved here over the last, 2 decades, all throughout the Low Country, not just in the city of Charleston or the county of Charleston, but throughout the Tri-County. We are downstream of all that, right? So we have to watch what's going on in our neighboring jurisdictions' effort with land use, because if it's a connected floodplain, we're downstream of that. So we have to work, right? That we have to work collaboratively with the county and other jurisdictions. And that's actually something we're doing. We have a comprehensive integrated water plan under development now. It's across the city. And I stress that because a lot of people think of Charleston as primarily being the peninsula, which is the historic core, and where everyone wants to come and visit because it's so beautiful and great restaurants and things. But as I mentioned, we have 157,000 people spread across these, 2 barrier islands and 3 peninsulas across 2 counties. The city does. So, we have to manage all of that, the development across that area. So it's just, it's tricky in some ways. We're downstream from a lot.
Yeah.
So
literally, yeah.
that coordination is just essential. And that's a big challenge because developers and builders and, project managers, they naturally focus on a particular boundary, and they work on a solution within that boundary for a certain outcome. When in fact, Katie and I have to get people to think beyond that.
Yeah.
Because again, floodplains, water just doesn't care about political boundaries, and neither does carbon, right? Yeah. So we have to get people to think in that broader sense. But the deliverables that those folks have to produce are very well defined, and that narrow definition is a huge challenge for the goals that we have.
Yeah. Well, can you talk a little about how you've engaged some of those regional partners? Because that does seem like maybe the hardest part of your work is like literally being downstream from some of these folks and trying to get them all on board for a similar or at least aligned policy goals, right?
Yeah. Katie has a wonderful example on composting, how she's been able to leverage what the city's done and go further. You want to talk about that, Katie?
Sure. So the idea for the compost program actually came from a partner, a local partner. And then we saw the opportunity at the city to apply for a grant to support it. They wrote us a letter of support and we won that grant. And then we were able to implement the pilot project. So we have all kinds of volunteers that support that program, volunteers at each drop site that oversee it, volunteers that go do presentations about it to other folks. So it's just a tremendous effort. I'd also say I think a lot of what we do in the sustainability office depends heavily on regional partners. We passed a single-use plastic ban back in 2019. And that was largely in part due to support from so many regional partners that got it out on their listservs and, made it a priority for citizens to support that. We had a large amount of people show up at city council that spoke in favor of that ordinance. So it was really, really a group effort. It was not just city led. So it's pretty exciting to see the power in numbers that we can have when we work together.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Right. And I was just going to add, so, we have this water plan under development. Again, it looks across the political boundaries to understand, how water manifests or moves across the floodplain, and mostly floodplains here and channels, not necessarily floodways, but we do have a few of those too. But we're trying to understand that. And in fact, we are going to coordinate with our neighboring jurisdictions on, how we manage this. So that's really important. The state Office of Resilience manages a lot of the buyout programs across the state. The home acquisition, repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, and they're doing that at sort of a statewide level. And they really want to move beyond the parcel by parcel or the home by home effort, which is, that's how federal policy is established or set up right now. But they're looking at how do we do buyouts at scale? And in the city, we are pondering the exact same thing, because we have done a buyout at scale in a suburban neighborhood a couple of years ago, and we're turning that buyout area. It's a 6-acre parcel that had 32 homes on it. We're turning that into a stormwater park, stormwater management park, so multiple benefits. And so we're trying to do that. We just set up a collaboration with the town of Mount Pleasant, which is just across the Cooper River from us. It's a rather large place, a lot of people, the town of North Charleston, the city of Charleston, and the county. So that's the first, second, and fourth largest cities in the state. We're going to work on a long-term, climate modeling effort and water flood risk effort to see what it looks like for us in the long term. So not just the city or not just the town of Mount Pleasant, but together across the county, so that we can then start to, approach county leaders and city leaders in these jurisdictions, say, we can't be working in silos. Yes, we have different voters, but by golly, we have to work together because of the way the water is going to impact all of us.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of different ways that we are working sort of upstream, both in the political sense, upstream, downstream in the political sense, as well as in the water and climate sense.
Very cool. That's awesome. Well, and one other thing I wanted to highlight, and again, we'll be sure to link to, is you guys have initiative trackers for both the climate action plan and the sea level rise strategy, so you can kind of see what progress has been made. So, is there anything you guys want to share about those? Or I thought they were pretty cool, and we'll definitely share them when this episode comes out.
Oh, that's great! Thank you. The purpose of those was really just to help be more transparent with community members, so folks can see what we're working on, what's in the queue, what's coming. And especially given our limited capacity, we try to get that message out that we can't work on everything at once. We really need to prioritize.
Right. And the flooding and sea level rise tracker was just updated. So it's not yet, it's going to be part of the update to the flooding and sea level rise strategy. So that is, stay tuned. That update should be out soon. But the current tracker is a bit out of date. But there are a lot of things we've already done and accomplished. We would say, we've checked the box on those. But sometimes those things they lead to further iterations or further deepening of those efforts. So again, that's what this update will show when we get it out, hopefully again in the next month or two.
Very cool. All right. Well, and before we kind of wrap, Katie, we can make you go first on this, but I want to hear from both of you. Are there any other initiatives that you worked on that we haven't talked about that you want to share about? And then is there anything that's maybe that's coming out soon or that you're working on currently that our listeners should keep an eye out for?
Sure. So some of the big items we're working on that will transition into next year really well are related to electric vehicle infrastructure. So we're working on everything from a regional infrastructure plan that would be for public parking. So that would include all our city parking garages and city lots. Then we're also collaborating with the state to electrify all the highways and the alternative fuel corridors as part of the new National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funding. Then we are also working on our internal fleet transition plan and infrastructure for that. And finally, we are also working on how do we get more EV charging access into new multifamily development. So we're working with our development community and collaborating with those folks to try to develop a very simple, flexible code that would require some EV infrastructure in new construction, especially for multifamily and commercial. So those are some big things on the horizon for next year.
Awesome. And Dan, what about you?
Well, a couple things. So the City of Charleston is working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on a Charleston Peninsula storm surge reduction project. And these are really complex things. They have to follow federal rules and all that. But we've completed our feasibility study. The benefit cost ratio for this project is very high because we have so much concentrated risk on the peninsula. And that, hopefully that will be moved forward through Congress with an authorization, sometime in the next couple months. One of the things we're doing, and then we'll move into the design phase. And one of the things that we're doing is I'm working with the National Academy of Sciences and some other folks in the Army Corps and stakeholders outside of it to help to modernize the federal policy guidance that the Army Corps must follow when they're doing these projects. And right now, the Army Corps of Engineers, they have a number of processes and preferences in how they mitigate risk, and we need to think about how you integrate the risk mitigation so maybe the dollars go further. And one of the really interesting things, a lot of folks are working on this. Europe is a little bit further ahead than the U.S. is on this, but nature-based systems or green infrastructure or natural and nature-based systems is the Army Corps. That's their jargon. We're learning more and more about the benefits of those and the differences in performance of those things, and then the maintenance of those things, because they're not maintenance free. You have to manage them too, just like you have to paint steel or iron, it'll rust, right? So there's things that we're learning here, and we're trying to incorporate, make improvements to the benefit cost analysis processes that right now tend to screen out natural or nature-based approaches to federal projects because they screen them out early, so they are never considered as a legitimate alternative. And we need to change that. So there are a lot of people who have been working on this, but the city is too. So that's great. We're going to undertake a resilience plan with an environmental justice community on the peninsula that needs some attention, and they have different kinds of flood risks, and we're trying to work with them to see what they want and how they would advise us to approach this. And then the city adopted its update to the comprehensive plan in October of 2021. It is one of the first, maybe the only comprehensive plan in the United States that uses land elevation as the primary sort of guiding mechanism for how we develop. And so I'd encourage everyone to look at that. But so that's great. That's the comp plan. So that's the aspiration and the direction. But we need to turn that into ordinance language. And so we have a rewrite of our zoning ordinance starting real soon. And we're going to try to translate that elevation, that land and water elevation as the development framing approach. We're going to try to turn that into zoning ordinance language. So stay tuned. I think, we're trying some innovative things here. So stay tuned.
That's awesome. Very cool. So we'll have to have you back once you figured that out. Cool. So our traditional last question on the podcast is usually the hardest one. And for two guests, you could either have a shared answer, or you guys can each have one, and we'll make our producer pick. But if you could be the Gov Love DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
It is a hard one. I'm always a big fan of Imagine by John Lennon.
Nice. Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a really good one, Katie. I had I had overlooked this question, so I don't have a good song. When you interview us the next time, or you come back to us to see what we're doing, I'll give you a good answer at that point.
Perfect. Well, good thing Katie was prepared. We'll use Imagine. That's perfect.
That's great.
And with that ends our episode today. Katie, Dale, thank you so much for coming on Talk with Me and sharing your expertise and what you guys are working on. This has been fascinating. This is really cool.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders, and the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at the handle @GovLovePodcast. Subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app, and if you're already subscribed, go tell a friend or colleague about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. With that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.